My presentation will be rather from the point of view of I'm a political scientist, and so it's a good thing that this kind of like perspective has not been so much here so far, kind of like on agenda, and while I'll be also commenting, for instance, economy or other, it's always from my perspective. I have the democracy and politics in front of me, and there is now that Finland is having its 100th kind of anniversary. The Office of Statistics it produced a kind of like it compiled a series of indicators where it has shown how Finland is at the top of this and that, and also the other Nordic countries. It's in many of these indicators, especially if we take indicators connected with welfare, social welfare and welfare in general, it is a little bit even embarrassing to read the indicators where Finland is constantly even at the top, or at least one among the 5 other Nordic countries. It is not a great surprise that Finland has the second lowest inequality among children in the world, or that Finland maternal mortality is the lowest in the world in Finland, and for instance gender equality, which is extremely important as far as, for instance, the Nordic welfare state constitution is concerned, is in world comparison it is really good. But also in terms of poverty rate, or in terms of some sustainable society index, for instance, in comparison of human well-being, the Nordic countries are faring really good. I have to say that many of these indicators are based. Some are based, of course, kind of like OECD or Eurostat. They are based on statistics and kind of like rather objective criteria. But many of these are based on professional evaluations and appraisals. And it means that the opinions and ideas that citizens have may not coincide with the indicators. There has been much research done in the Nordic countries where some of these, in the case of some of these indicators, it has been asked by surveys from people what they think, and they have much more critical point of view about what's the situation of, for instance, the human well-being, the subjective well-being, how it's experienced in the Nordic countries. But it can be also in such a way that such a critique or such a kind of like a critical attitude is also positive, because it means that there is lots to be done still. But I'd like to point to another set of indicators, not just the welfare indicators, but available indicators which rather express the quality of the political life and the quality of what could say about the democratic regimes. My basic claim is, and I come to this also later, my basic claim is that it is the quality of the democratic regime which has been, and also the history of this democracy, the Nordic democracy, which has been crucial in also producing such a welfare regime. And if you look at some of the indicators, of course in terms of security and safety, the Nordic countries are at the top. But also looking at something like next to Danes, Finns vote in the freest and most reliable elections, which is based on a research survey. Or in questions of Finland has the most personal freedom and choice in the world, which is based on the social progress index. I'm pretty sure there would be a lot of people and even researchers that could kind of challenge these indexes. But these are, at least they reflect and express, I think, the quality of the political life. As a critique, one could take, for instance, Finland is the third best country in adhering to the rule of law in the world. It is the rule of law index, and second best in protecting human rights. One could be very critical of, well, this is an index, and this is a very respectable index, this rule of law of index. But if, for instance, we take now the immigration, and what is happening in Finland when there are immigrants or refugees being sent back to Afghan and to the countries where they are very at the real risk. It doesn't really much tell about how the human rights are protected. So these are, I think these must be challenged and questioned. But the basic fact is that the quality of the political regime is interesting. So there are various explanations for the success of the Nordic welfare regimes. There are, it can be Nordic welfare model. Well, not until the 70s or 80s, one never talked about Nordic model. When the Nordic welfare states were established, they were not kind of like worked out in accordance with some model. Pauli Kettunen has done an historian in Finland, a great job in this field. Nordic variety of capitalism, the particular long history where there's the free peasantries, social democratic regime, etc., Lutheranism. There are lots of this, but I prefer here. This is a perspective. This is not just one explanation, but a perspective that politics matters. Politics, the role of politics has been important, and not just in terms of power resource theory, like Walter Korpis and others, or in terms of institutions of the polity. But I think that really the crucial thing in the case of the Nordic countries is that politics matters in the Nordic success, especially due to this kind of capabilities of conflict resolution powers that has guaranteed a stable and secure path of development. This is something that it was interesting to listen to Nina. And when she took up Åström's principles, there were actually principles for this kind of conflict resolution in small groups. And those 10 principles were actually kind of principles how to handle with these dilemmas or contradictions in certain situations. But my point is that behind this kind of conflict resolution powers, it's a question about a certain kind of deliberative, persuasive conception of politics. And it has its counterpart in the act of committing oneself to a definite standpoint as a decisive aspect of politics. And both of these conceptions presume contingency and kind of aleatory moment. And share the insight that there can never be sufficient grounds for a decision to be taken when acting politically. This is the decisive point, that in the Nordic case, the politics has been there to intervene because the contingency, the uncertainty of the future has been recognized. And they have not acted as if we knew what the future is, or as if we all had consensus about the future. And this is also has to do with the idea that there is this kind of like an open free space for political and civic action. And it makes a solution to be found between different social forces and movements. Of course, in the Nordic case, this has been easier than in many other countries and in political cultures, because it's pretty socially homogeneous demos, and without very strong, for instance, religious conflicts, etc. But still, the case is that these contradictions have been recognized, taken on agenda, and tried to find out solutions for them. I personally consider this to be this is a relational approach, that it is, but I come back to this. And in such a conception of politics, there is no need for this kind of contractual and contrafactual and this kind of contract type of reasoning. Kind of like there would be a social contract, kind of like as if we had made a solution, or as if we had made an agreement to do this and that. It's also, I don't go to the theory history of the Nordic countries, but it is also interesting that even in the 18th century, for instance, Sweden, the contract theories were not in vague. Well, I like this these graphs, but my point is kind of like that I have used these classic antique words like thymos, which means kind of like anger, and there's the mythos and ethos, nomos and logos. But the idea is that at the right-hand side corner down there are contradictions and strifes and struggles between different groups and between different opinions, etc. And the idea is that they have to be kind of like processed and worked and by taking them to the political arena and trying to find for them some solutions. And now the case is, in the Nordic case, that two approaches are kind of like challenged. Another is kind of like that it's not being behaved as if we had full information about the situation, so that we could only kind of lean on experts or lean on this and that kind of like authoritarian opinion or authority. Or on the other hand, we can't take for granted that there would be somehow consensus a priori, and we could just kind of start. But we have to process these contradictions by way of these arenas. And I'll just take one person who is very important here. And when Nina said that there are important intellectual groups, this is the Swedish philosopher Axel Hegerström, who was the Uppsala philosopher, and he had a tremendous influence on Myrdal, on Tingsten, on many others. And he kind of like criticized two things. One is kind of like that all kinds of will theories, kind of like general will or referring to a general will or some, is a metaphysical fiction, which means that this mythos would be a kind of like a metaphysical fiction. On the other hand, he criticized this kind of objective value theories, that there are some objective values or universal, naturally given values, which has made somebody claim that he is a nihilist. Well, I don't think he is a nihilist. He just kind of challenged this kind of like observation. And what he did was kind of like he pointed very pragmatically out that we have to deal with these things politically. And we have to kind of discuss and try to find solutions for them. So one of these tough questions for politics to deal with is the social question. And this is, of course, the crucial question for welfare state development. When Hannah Arendt wrote his excellent book on revolution, and she compared American Revolution, she called it American Revolution, with the French Revolution, she argued that taking up the social question on agenda in the French Revolution was the real menace and led to those disastrous consequences. And because in the American Revolution it was the constitutional questions which has put politically and on the agenda, the result was much better. And I think the Nordic countries are an example of being able to deal with these social questions and social problems on agenda, which are wicked problems. But it is, I think, to prove that their political system and their political life has been working and functioning so well that it has been able to deal with these social questions on agenda. And my claim here is, and this is the relational point is that why there has been this success in dealing with this is because of the high quality of the social relations. It is especially the relational quality of the society in its different social relations, but also in their political relations, economic relations, as Per was very wonderfully claiming. And also I think Nina's kind of like discussions about this Nordic humanism is connected with also when I refer to Anders Nygren and the theological and the new Lutheran interpretation. They are all connected with these social relations. And the role of politics as action in this sense is decisive, is crucial, because it has the function of formation and mediation of these social relations. But on the other hand, these social relations, the quality of these social relations is necessary for such a political life to be possible. For these reasons, I would characterize the Nordic welfare state as relational. Now there is in Great Britain, there has been for some 5 years, 6 years, there has been a discussion on the relational state discussion and relational welfare discussion. And they are trying to find some new kind of like alternatives to this new public management and the traditional welfare state kind of like organizations or the ways of doing things. From the Nordic perspective, I don't think that there's much new in this discussion. I just don't find it very novel at all in this sense. But this may be, I think that we should not be arrogant. But I don't, on the other hand, I don't like also this kind of all the time emphasizing that we have to be so humble and we have to be so humble. I think the Finns have been too humble for too long time. But that's another matter. So my point is that when we talk that the Nordic welfare states, they have been organized, they have been constructed, they have been built on the ground of certain basic principles like universalism, public responsibility, equality, solidarity, and individual autonomy. I personally don't think that these should be understood as some basic values, or even less as some kind of objective values, etc. These are rather relational principles. These are principles how to organize certain relations between persons, with their institutions, between procedures. These are relational. In Foucault's term, one could say that these are governmental rationalities. and they are relational rationalities because they are connected with relations. And so I very much agree with Nina's presentations that in order to understand the Nordic welfare state, we have to go deeper into this kind of like basic ground, this kind of like mental foundations on which these practices and institutions have been built. And I don't like very much it's a model discussion because it's very superficial, because it's kind of like it has different variables and then you are looking at how these variables are connected with certain concepts. It's important, but it doesn't go deep enough at all. Robert Cover, who is an interesting lawyer, legal scholar, who not anymore with us, but he has said that all the societies and their legal practices are based on these normos, on these basic common interpretive commitments to certain basic principles. In this case, this would be a question about this normos. When we are talking that in the Nordic case, it's because of the kind of virtuous circle of development. I think that when Per was discussing about the Danish model, how it started, it's kind of like a virtuous circle of development where these different kind of like elements and from different dimensions, these moments, they combine and produce. They are social, political, economic, legal, etc. That's the strong point. That we can't say that it is just because of the economics as such or just because politics, but it makes it possible how they are combined in a further manner. And this interoperability, actually this is the relational idea also, that how they combine. And in this case, Myrdal talked about cumulative causation, and actually Knut Wicksell already had this kind of idea. And the idea of this kind of cumulative causation is one could say that it's a kind of like a relational causation, what is behind this kind of development. So that's. But these relational structures, it is also the other way around, that the strong democracy and politics would not have been possible without the existence of these societal relations, these social relations. And to put it very briefly, I would say that I'll do it in these kind of 4 levels. That as far as the Nordic democratic regimes are concerned, I would say that there are these 4 levels which are important. First thing is, as far as electoral and decision rules are concerned, is the proportional representation. Political scientists have done a lot of research in this, and in the case of the Nordic countries, even though the system is proportional representation, it has worked pretty well. It hasn't been need for this kind of executive majority or the majoritarian system, but because of the proportional representation, all the groups and all the different, even minor groups have been able to bring forth and give their proposals to the agenda. Another beneath this is the openness, the publicity, the deliberative space, that you trust discussion. There is a great difference, I think, between Sweden and, well, has been between Sweden and Finland here. Sweden has trusted in much more in this public discussion. Sometimes it's even say that the Swedes just discuss, but we Finns decide. kind of, we decide, but the Swedes, they just discuss it. Well, look at the consequences. Sometimes it's better to discuss and then make a decision. But then also, if you look at the figures of civic action and the civic society, the Nordic countries have been at the top. Now it has gone down very much, especially in Finland, for instance, political associations and also economic associations. But still, there are these kind of like political opportunity structures making the political participation possible. But the last thing, and this I would really emphasize, is this autonomy has been taken up, and also it was the work autonomy which is important, but this kind of individual autonomy. I don't agree with Lars Tredgaard's idea about that there would be some kind of contract, a social contract, or about his talk about state individualism. But he's certainly right when he is writing that this overarching ambition in the Nordic countries has been to liberate the individual citizen from all forms of subordination and dependence in civil society, the poor from charity, the workers from their employers, wives from their husbands, children from their parents. And in practice, the primacy of individual autonomy has been institutionalized through a plethora of law and politics. This means that autonomy, freedom as autonomy, means capabilities, abilities to participate. It's not just kind of some individual liberty, but you have to have these relational like preconditions to be able to realize and actualize your freedom and autonomy. And this means that Nordic welfare state, when it has produced this kind of like strong also security for persons, it has been also the prerequisite for citizen action, for the citizens to be able to participate and take part. These again go in both directions, and I would emphasize this really the autonomy. But now I come to the part where this critique has started, the critique of the Nordic welfare state. Personally, I think that the real threat in this critique is not just the critique of that the welfare services are being privatized or this and that about the welfare state. I think that the more threatening thing for me is the critique of democracy. Behind the critique of the welfare state in the Nordic case is easily the critique against democracy. For instance, in the case of Finland now, when we have this social and health services reform, and the constitutional law has been kind of like an obstacle to make it go through. There is now an attack, a fierce attack on the constitutional law. But it is not just that attack on the constitutional law, but actually it is also an attack, even though it's framed in terms of parliamentarism, it can be an attack on the certain form of democratic functioning. Well, it's not. When Sandy was showing the picture of how the productivity and the shares of the wages have kind of like departed, this decoupling effect. It started around the 1970s in the States. In the 1970s, it's just a case where Robert Vogel was talking about characterizing that it's the fourth great awakening, which means this kind of really moral and intellectual kind of like reform or restoration that took place. But I would say that there was an interesting also the Trilateral Commission ordered there a study about the working of democracy, with Samuel Huntington and Watanabe, and they wrote, and it was called The Crisis of Democracy. This is very decisive, because it just kind of like reflects what was happening, that democracy was taken as an object of critique, because it was claimed that democracy is a system which kind of like feeds demands which it can't respond to. And so what had to be done is to govern democracy better and to find different kinds of other ways of governing than democratic representative government. And this is where this new public management and different forms of governance came out and were developed. It started in the 1970s in the States. And so it was the first critique on decision making was that it's this kind of excess demand for all kinds, that there is no end to these demands if we let the democracy work as it does. And so it was also, the next step was being concluded that it's the question of a crisis of democracy, that we have to do something about it. And this kind of landed in the Nordic countries. I'm talking rather about Finland. This kind of critique and certain forms of it landed in the 1990s and during the last 15, 20 years. And the next step was also that this was then connected with the idea of criticizing the rigidities of the labor market, of the market, or these kind of different kind of rigidities in the society as a whole. And there was also this, then came the sustainability gap. But also maybe the very intriguing critique would be kind of like the Friedmanian critique of the welfare state, that it is a system that is actually like working on the benefit of the well-to-do. Because they are the ones that are being schooled, and they are the ones that live longer, and so these guys that are not schooled so much, they have to go work before, and they start paying taxes before. And if you look at the end result, it can be that it's the well-to-do that benefit. But that hasn't been taken so much up in Finland. But ultimately, the critique, I think that the main critique of the welfare state, and this is connected also with the critique of the democracy, is that it produces dependencies. And it produces these kind of like persons that are dependent on the state, who are not active and who have no incentives. And so basically it all starts from how to kind of like re-govern and how to remold the individual and to make him or her to adjust to the system. And I think, personally, I think that unfortunately also the for instance, social democratic politics, this kind of Schröder, Blair, Lipponen, Persson, kind of like change that happened around late 80s, 90s, took up the same kind of like critique and idea. That the left has, political left has too much hanged itself with the idea of equality, and we should take up rather the freedom of the individual, the free choice and the choice of the individual. But it should not be forgotten that this free choice of an abstract individual is totally other thing than this autonomous individual who are made capable and who have been enabled to participate and make the choices. All these kind of like these levels of the critique are very, very clear if you look at this social and health services reform that is taking place in Finland at the moment. But okay. So I have to go very quickly because I have 5 minutes left. Well, I don't like to talk about neoliberalism. I rather talk about the monetization, what has taken place. And for monetization, for me, is an expression for a process when money starts to overdetermine social relations. And so, to make it very, very quick, monetization in this sense is a kind of doctrine or policy doctrine. I'm not talking about economics. Economics is totally another matter. They should not be blamed for this, which is kind of like this folklore or this common sense and this kind of rather policy like agenda. And it has, at these levels, the demands are that market demands tell about health needs, for instance. Markets talk in terms of exit, and we should listen to what the markets say. And markets deliver health services optimally, and personal health care should be interpreted as entrepreneurial. And this is kind of like the positive credo: market info, market access, market design, market incentives. And the point is that this challenge of monetization to the Nordic welfare state is, I think, actual at the moment. And for instance, if we take this, as I all the time refer to this social and health services reform, it is very explicit there that what is being emphasized is that we should listen to market info as to what, for instance, the health needs are. And it is emphasized that the problem with the present organization and system is that not all persons can get the services they want. And so this kind of market access to the market is made a kind of criteria of justice. And then this kind of corporatization is seen as the ideal form for delivering the health services, which is, and then the last thing is about this entrepreneur as an example of the behavior. But I'll just take this again a picture, but what is the political consequence of this monetization? And to put it very briefly, because I haven't time much, is to say that what takes place in this monetization and as a kind of like a consequence of it is that there is a tendency to centralize decision making in the executive. And while centralizing the decision making to the executive, you need on the other hand the performative aspect of politics that will be kind of like exaggerated. When you make the decisions in small circles, then you have to sell the decisions made. It has a lot of consequences for the political arena of action. There's kind of like a closure. And to make it very briefly, what is the consequence of all this is that the uncertainty is becoming really the number one issue. The uncertainty about the future, the uncertainty about life horizons. What happens is kind of like in the Koselleckian terms, one could say that the space of experience and the horizon of expectations kind of like coincide together and make it the situation very, very, very uncertain. And what's the consequence we have seen is about this increasing uncertainty and perplexity is populism. Fortunately, in Finland, like the populist party now, in the last polls, it was only under 7%, but in other Nordic countries, it's much higher. But populism is usually, it's always a kind of a consequence and a reaction to this uncertainty. And if you look at and if you research it in historically, it has been always connected with financial crisis, with the debt, even in the late 19th century United States or in the Germany, etc. And it is distrust, anxiety, insecurity, melancholy, and rage are the kind of like the ingredients, the dimensions of this reaction to this uncertainty that is taking place. And I think populism in this sense is a real challenge. It is really a challenge to to the Nordic welfare state, which should not be underestimated. And so the true challenge, I'll take 3 minutes. The true challenge of the Nordic welfare state, I think, is in political terms, is uncertainty. And we live kind of like this age of anxiety in this sense. And the strength of the Nordic welfare states and the Nordic democratic form of politics has been especially its ability to cope with contingency and with the aleatory moment. This has been, I emphasize when I refer to the Stockholm School of Economics, I'm not talking as an economics, but I like the history of the Stockholm School of Economics in this sense, that when, for instance, Myrdal made his dissertation, he used Frank Knight's book, Uncertainty and Risk. And he said that most of the decisions made in economy are made not in terms of risk, but in terms of uncertainty. And because there's uncertainty in economy, that opens a way that politics has to intervene, to stabilize, to try to find some kind of stabilities and paths of development of equilibrium. Because we can't trust that in terms of uncertainty, it just kind of happens just like this. Now, this uncertainty, when it has like developed lately, the populists are looking for the restrainer, kind of like in classical terms it would be said the katecheon. But the neoliberalism tries to answer it with this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, kind of like trying to make their own doctrines and policies to become a common sense. And then, but I think the real challenge for the Nordic welfare state is we can't anymore trust even this kind of social investment state ideas, even though I haven't been very fascinated with them either. But we would have to find some kind of social sustainable state idea. And this move must surpass the idea, the dichotomy that we are just talking in terms of markets or state. There should be kind of like this kind of relational approach. And here we are. And so I'll just kind of try to end that what I find as the most important agenda. This is no alternative, but this is kind of like where I see the biggest challenges to be. And if we start from the right-hand side down corner, as far as the autonomy is concerned, and this is connected with what Per was talking about. I think that is that if we take precarization, the working life has really changed a lot and is changing tremendously. And it's not just a question of understanding that we could understand work in some kind of like traditional sense, because life and work are so intermingled together. And precarization is really a challenge, even though it's nothing in Nordic countries, for instance, in comparison to the Anglo-Saxon countries. But we should have to be able to think over what would be this kind of relation between different work forms or productive life forms. And this high-quality work and this kind of low-quality work, the division is widening. Another thing is that as far as this distribution is concerned and financial is concerned, this kind of relation between vested interest is important. It's not so that when we talk about basic income, it is just about some kind of form of taxation. It is actually a way of talking about how do we participate, what is our share in the commonwealth, and kind of like in terms of these commons. This is where this discussion should be going to. It may be that it's not participatory income or basic income, but how are we, what is our share in the commonwealth? That is, I think, the question. Universalism has to be also rethought in the face of globalization, in the case of really this kind of movement. And we have to have some kind of transnational, international cooperation clauses. Tobin tax, it's not just, but we have to have some even transnational like cooperation and find some kind of like cooperative clauses for cooperation in terms of how to govern some of these movements. Because in terms of solidarity, we have to think these constitutional rules. And for instance, in the case of Finland, it's a question of constitution. There is extremely important this relational constitution discussion that has started in Finland. For instance, Karl Tuori has written, where social constitution, economic constitution, political constitution, judicial constitution, they have to be considered together. And the last one is that this new medialization and this kind of new publicity, the kind of like marketization of the media makes it difficult to behave in publicity as before. And we really have to think over this kind of relation between debatable legitimacies. But personally, I think that the Nordic countries have really good chances of succeeding in this. Thanks.
Thank you, Sakari.